question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to address the debate of the Cognate Children and Young Persons Care and Protection Amendment Bill 2018 and the National Disability Insurance Scheme Worker Checks Bill of 2018. I acknowledge the members for Bankstown, Castle Hill, my ministerial colleague, Wyong, Shellharbour, Maitland, Charlestown, Port Macquarie, Mount Druitt, Fairfield, Blacktown, Cessnock, Newcastle, Newtown and Lake Macquarie, who have contributed to the debate in this chamber. I note the absence of some members of those opposite, including the member for Kira, who has been advocating positively for some of these changes, changes I understand the member for Bankstown refuses to consider, which I have to say says more about her than it does about those opposite who do want the best for vulnerable children and families. And I thank the member for Kira for his advocacy for tougher penalties where harm is caused against a child, and I'm sorry that his own Shadow Minister has let him down. I do acknowledge that the NDIS Worker Check Bill has the support of those opposite, for which I'm grateful. So today I'll speak in reply to the lies told in the other place and in this House on the Child Protection Amendment Bill. There's been much said in the other place and in this House on the intention of the Care and Protection Amendment Bill. I will start by saying Labor and the Greens are a disgrace for opposing this bill. 5 months out from the election, they've engaged in a political stunt. They object to shorter care orders for permanency. They object to adoption. They object to law reform to improve the lives of vulnerable children and families. They clearly have no real interest in reform, and I think they never have. For them, it's just all a stunt. Mr Deputy Speaker, we get elected to this place to make decisions, and that's what we are doing today. I have listened carefully to the debate in both houses, and I want to share with you what I find most concerning. That there's been little focus from anyone from the other side of the consideration of the child, of their need for safety and certainty. There have been many grandiose statements about parents and their loss and their needs, but very little has been said about the impact of child abuse and neglect that these children experience, sadly, at the hands of those that say they love them most. It is true that parents may be affected by mental health, drug and alcohol problems, and I could go on. But those opposites seem to forget that the children we're talking about are hurt by their parents despite the love they have for their children. Their actions cause their children harm. The statutory responsibility I hold as the Minister is for the child, for the child. No other agency in government is tasked with considering first and foremost the child. I thank the member for Lake Macquarie, who actually did recognise that is the role of the Minister. As Minister, I am responsible for the lives of vulnerable children. I alone carry that responsibility for this Parliament, for the parents, the community and the families who cannot. So let me remind the House of the facts. Under this government, over the past 2 years since 2015-16, we have reduced the number of children entering out-of-home care by 44%, and that includes a 42% reduction in the number of Aboriginal children entering care. This is the largest decrease in the number of children entering out-of-home care in at least a decade. Over the same period, since 2015-16, we are now starting to see a reduction in the total number of children in care, which has fallen by 2.5%. This government wants children to remain safely with their families, and those figures show you we are delivering on that determination. Over 900 Aboriginal children are living in guardianship arrangements, with almost all of these children living with family members or Aboriginal people as per the Aboriginal placement principles and receiving guardianship support payments. Over the past 5 years, there have been 501 adoptions from care. Only 13 of those adoptions were Aboriginal children, of which 8 were adolescents and consented to their own adoption. This is not a government creating another stolen generation, and it is an outrageous slur that it is being said. This is a government working hard to keep children at home with their families. Those opposite can't stand that this government is leading policy and legislative reform, working to keep families together and to give vulnerable children permanency. I remind the House that under Labor the number of children in out-of-home care tripled from 1996 to 2010. Under Labor's watch, the number of children in care increased from almost 5,000 in 1996 to 17,400 in 2010. Over that same period, indeed, the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in care quadrupled. That was Labor's record. Under Labor, record numbers of children went into care. Under this government, large numbers are safely staying out of care. Now, I am not going to accuse Labor of another stolen generation. That's cheap, and it's using that language is inappropriate and disrespectful, actually, to the families of the stolen generation who suffered so much and had felt so much trauma. Families where children were dragged kicking and screaming from mothers, put into homes, abused, turned into domestic servants and unskilled labourers, left to fend for themselves, never to see their parents again. Lied to, lied to, lied to. They were appalling times in our history, and they must never be forgotten. But that is not what we are doing here. And there are instead very vulnerable people listening to those opposite Labor and the Greens, listening to their lies and scaremongering and reawakening that trauma. The only people this serves is those opposite. It does not serve the very people we are here to represent, to support and to protect. It is a political tactic by those opposite to grab cheap media by exploiting the history of some of the most vulnerable people in this state and turning it to fear. Look at your own record. Look at what you did. Don't comment on legislation and reform that you clearly do not understand, have not read and do not care to read. Mr Deputy Speaker, let me continue just for a moment on the record of those opposite compared to this side of the House. I remind the House that under Labor, caseworkers saw just 12,702 children reported at risk of significant harm in 2010-11. We have now more than doubled that, with 26,196 children seen in 17-18. And there is more to do to keep that number rising. Under Labor, the caseworker vacancy rate ballooned to 13% in 2009-10. No wonder they didn't see children. In the June quarter of this year, it was 0%, 0% across the state, Mr Deputy Speaker. We now have more caseworkers on the ground than ever before. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, this debate has shown what Labor really stands for. It shows they are opposed to reform. It shows they believe that statutory force is more desirable than working early to keep families together. They stand for children, obviously, being on long-term orders in the parental responsibility of the minister until 18, rather than being restored safely to their parents sooner, or finding stability with one family through guardianship or open adoption, if that is in the child's best interest. The child's best interest. They stand for a big foster care system, which does not encourage supports to be brought in to help keep families together. Labor have promised to repeal these amendments when they come to government. It will see a new chapter in Labor's long history of mismanagement and failure of child protection. I have no doubt we will see a return to the bad old days of removing children first and asking questions later, or actually just not seeing children at all. That is what Labor did over 16 years, and it is little wonder they ended up in a special commission of inquiry. The member for Bankstown and some of those opposite have become obsessed with my legacy. Well, here's a message for Labor and the Greens. My legacy is how this government has transformed the child protection system over the past 7.5 years. Permanency, seeing more children, a 44% reduction of new entries into care, record low caseworker vacancies, more caseworkers on the front line, and record child protection funding. Mr Deputy Speaker, during this debate here and in the other place, Labor and the Greens have lied. Take adoption. Despite the dishonest rhetoric of those opposite, this bill is not about adoption. There is only one amendment to the Adoption Act, which relates to an existing provision. This bill is actually about ensuring vulnerable children have the certainty of a family, whether that's their birth family, guardian, or adoptive family. It is about imbuing the child protection system, finally, with an urgency commensurate with the fleeting nature of childhoods, with a compassion which recognises the deep and human need in each child to belong, to love and be loved, to have stability. Not that they'll listen and learn, they're far too busy playing political games to really care about what they should support in this bill. Those opposite, including the Greens, are opposed to alternative dispute resolution. They say that legal advice must be inserted into alternative dispute resolution. Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, alternative dispute resolution processes help families solve their problems so they can keep the family together without the need for litigation. And isn't that what we would all want? I remind the House, alternative dispute resolution can already be ordered by the court, including a dispute resolution conference. Parties can already be legally represented at these dispute resolution conferences. Families can already also request legal advice from legal aid, community legal centres or law access. So why the lies? Why amendments that are lies? In both the consultation paper and report back on these reforms, the government has referred to the use of family group conferencing. This is the preferred model for families, as it is a family-led process. Families develop a plan and families implement the plan. Families address child protection risks. Families keep their children safe. Do you understand actually what that means for families? Poor, vulnerable families? It gives them a power to be able to come up with a solution to their own crisis. Labor believes that the state knows best. Well, actually, they're wrong. Mr. Deputy Speaker, over 900 family group conferences have taken place over the last 3 years, and the evidence is strong. Children are less likely to enter care. Children are less likely to be reported to FACS afterwards when they have a family group conference. Because that is the power of the family. The power of the family, the basic social unit of Western society. Something the left has always feared and fought and wanted to tear down to replace it with the state. Families innately know. They report that the process is empowering, and they feel, sometimes for the first time, that they have a voice and control. And that is what empowering families is all about. And those opposite might want to think about this. Instead of trying to insert themselves and the state into the decision-making of families, we can empower families, a very fashionable word in the left, to do it for themselves. It says it all really, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Labor equals big government equals big intrusion, which means big contempt for the people you say you serve. Let's move on to the opposition to allow the court to consider whether restoration is realistic within 2 years. The member for Bankstown referred to this, as did the Greens. They're opposed to ensuring children have a chance at permanency. It was shocking to hear the Greens in the other place challenge the opinion of the President of the Children's Court. According to Mr. Shoebridge, despite admitting in debate last week, quote, "This is not an area of law I've had much involvement with," he was surprised by the view of the President of the Children's Court, a man who sees these cases day in and day out. Mr. Shoebridge said, "The advice given to the government is wrong, plain wrong." Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, let me say, I am not a lawyer, but I certainly understand the binding effect of case law and precedent. The current Act does not provide the court with the opportunity to give families a decent chance of a realistic possibility of restoration. And that is what we seek to rectify, so we act in the best interests of the child. I will quote Ree Campbell. Section 83, brackets 1, makes clear at what time the realistic possibility of restoration should be assessed. When the application for rescission or variation of a care order is before the court, it is at that time the court must assess whether there is a realistic possibility. It must not, at the time of the rescission or variation application, be merely a future possibility. It must, at that time, be a realistic possibility. At that time, the time of the court hearing. Mr. Deputy Speaker, for further clarity in the matter, the Department of Family and Community Services and Nathan, brackets 200-2018, New South Wales Children's Court 1, the President said, "What I do wish to emphasise in this judgment is the requirement in the decision of Slattery J and Ree Campbell that the finding in relation to restoration has to be made as at the day of the hearing, that is, today. What may or may not eventuate in the next year or 2 years is not the point." In other words, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this part of the Act has urgently needed reform to give families a better chance of restoration. And that is why it has the support of the President of the Children's Court. I remind the House the Tune Review showed children and young people, on average, stay in out-of-home care for 12.6 years, and many children experience multiple placements. The government says that is unacceptable. It is too long. It is a lost childhood. Labor and the Greens' opposition to this bill mean that they would rather see these children languish in care. I remind those opposite of what Associate Professor Amy Connolly-Wright and Professor Judith Cashmore wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 29th of October this year, and I quote, "Delays in permanent arrangements can result in adverse consequences for children's development. Longitudinal research has demonstrated that the longer children remain in homes inadequately protected from abuse and neglect, the more likely there will be long-term consequences. Harm can be compounded in the out-of-home care system if children experience temporary placements and frequent moves. Children, particularly young children, are likely to become attached to interim carers and then can experience further loss if they are moved. It is therefore crucial to place children in caring and stable homes that will become their permanent homes as soon as possible." The professors go on to say, "A child who has returned home unsuccessfully and has to come back into care or bounces from one temporary carer to another experiences loss and faces uncertainty. It is critical that decisions are made within the children's time frame." End quote. Mr. Deputy Speaker, tragically this is the experience of thousands of vulnerable children in the care system. I want to read to you the words of a wonderful young woman, Bobby, who has left care and is now 23. I spoke to her a couple of days ago. She says, "After being removed from my family when I was 7 years old, it wasn't until I was 15 that I found a home and family I could call my own. In those 8 years, I lived in over 16 homes. 16 different families with 16 different dynamics and sets of rules to learn and assimilate to. There came a time where being dropped by a stranger's door in front of a home with unfamiliar architecture wasn't scary anymore. It was just the way life was. I felt like I moved so frequently that there was no point in unpacking my bag. I was a really tough kid. I know that I didn't make it easy for foster families to love me. I was angry and overwhelmed by how little control I had in my life. I was dependent on those around me to make good decisions on my behalf, and dependent on them to provide and care for me. And sometimes they fell short. There'd be days when the things I had experienced were too big for my young brain to wrap around, and I'd explode with the inability to communicate what I needed and what I was feeling. I know this made it really hard for foster parents to want to keep me in their family. Now that I'm an adult, I can see clearly how a childhood of displacement and uncertainty has affected me. I get scared when I stay in one place for too long. I get itchy feet. I worry people get sick of me, and I overanalyze everything those around me do and say that could indicate whether or not they're deciding I'm worth keeping around. I constantly live with the fear of being a burden again. Finding my final foster family made all the difference to my life. They provided me with stability, something I hadn't felt before, and something I desperately needed. A broken branch grafted onto a new family tree. I finally felt like I could grow, like I wouldn't be ripped out again. It took a while, but their house eventually felt like a home. There was something profound about walking through their front door after school and feeling like I actually belonged, and feeling like it was my front door too. Stability made all the difference. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is children and young people like this young woman that this bill is intended to help. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will now turn to the lies told about the bill being a fast track from guardianship to adoption. Again, another lie to frighten vulnerable people and draw media attention for themselves. Guardianship and open adoption, as I have said time and time again, are permanency options for children who cannot live safely with their parents. The assertion made by those opposite and in the other place that guardianship and open adoption cut family and cultural ties are absolute lies and show their ignorance of existing law. They show their deep lack of knowledge of the legislation, the Supreme Court and practice in this area. And Labor should know better. It was in fact Labor in 2000 with the full support of this side of the House, which repealed the Adoption of Children Act 1965 and replaced it with the modern Adoption Act 2000 with appropriate safeguards for Aboriginal children. And that Act gives an opportunity to the Supreme Court to dispense with parental consent in certain circumstances. That was Labor's law, and we haven't changed it. 18 years later, Labor and the Greens have suddenly decided it's wrong. Another pre-election stunt. Mr Deputy Speaker, this debate has proven one thing. It is evident Labor are now opposed to adoption. They are opposed to permanency for vulnerable children. There are certainly existing safeguards in the current law in the Care and Protection and Adoption Act. The permanent placement principles in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child and young person placement principles clearly outline in current law the preferred placement pathway and hierarchy for children and young people. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, adoption is the last resort for permanent placement. If a child is an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander child, Section 90 of the Adoption Act requires that the court must not make an adoption order unless the relevant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander placement principles have been properly applied. In addition, Clause 75 of the Adoption Regulation specifies what must be included in an adoption plan. This includes details of the way in which the child is to be assisted to develop a healthy and positive cultural identity, and of ways in which links with the child's cultural heritage are to be fostered. The existing safeguards around the adoption of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people remain unchanged. The Adoption Act currently makes specific provisions that address the needs of Aboriginal children, families and communities, and sets out additional legislative requirements specific to the preparation of an adoption application for an Aboriginal child or young person. If the child is placed with a person who is not within an Aboriginal family or community, the adoption plan must provide for the child to have the opportunity to develop an identity with the Aboriginal community to which they belong. In fact, Mr Deputy Speaker, the obligations on an adoptive parent are far greater than those on a foster carer to ensure connection to birth family and culture. Adoption sets the very highest bar for a person wanting to parent a child. Without a demonstration and willingness to support positive birth family contact and cultural connection, the Supreme Court, not this Parliament, the Supreme Court is unlikely to make an adoption order. Similarly, a guardian must be able to demonstrate the same, a willingness to support a positive birth-family relationship and connection to culture. In addition, facts will not support an assessment for guardianship or open adoption where there is resistance to birth family and cultural connection. And nothing in this bill changes that. I don't really know how Labor can even look the Aboriginal community in the eye over this. As I say, under them, the number of Aboriginal children and young people in care quadrupled over 16 years, much more than for non-Aboriginal children. Under this government, the number of Aboriginal children entering care has reduced by 42% over the last 2 years. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is clear that those opposite and the Greens are hell-bent on painting a picture that Aboriginal people don't support this bill, and I recognise the Aboriginal perspective on adoption due to the stolen generation and appalling past practices of forced adoptions. I apologised in this very place to those who were forcibly removed through forced adoption practices. And like all members in this place, I do not want this to happen again. Claims that this bill does that are just wrong. I would like to acknowledge some of the support we've received for the bill. Deirdre Cheers, the CEO of Bernardo, said, "The amendments to the Children and Young Persons Care and Protection Act and the Adoption Act will streamline processes to provide vulnerable children with much-needed permanency as quickly as possible. Children cannot wait for adult timeframes for decisions to be made about their future. We welcome these reforms that will introduce child-centred timeframes for children," Ms Cheers said. Associate Professor D. Delaney Teal said, "This is a positive move to help ensure Aboriginal children and young people are supported in culturally safe environments. It will give the extended family the opportunity to be involved in decisions about the care of their children and reduce the number of Aboriginal children and young people being removed into out-of-home care." Life Without Barriers New South Wales State Director Roderick Best said, "Life Without Barriers welcomes all attempts to help children in out-of-home care secure safe and permanent homes. The bill tabled in Parliament by Minister Goward this week attempts to address some of the big legislative issues currently faced by children in out-of-home care. It is really important to see the emphasis in this bill on involving families through alternative dispute resolution, as well as removing court processes that impede reaching orders to help a child have a long-term, forever home, Mr Best said. I could go on, Mr Deputy Speaker. I've had correspondence from members of the public, including the Aboriginal community, encouraging these reforms. They've said, and I quote, "First of all, Minister Goward, bless you for helping our families on this issue. As a grandmother, this is just too important to be silent. The legislation gives parents more time to have their children restored." Another said, "Minister, as a father and grandfather of two, I wanted to provide my support to you on these important amendments. The safety, care and protection of our children must be at the heart of our child protection system, and so I thank you for these amendments that further embed that principle. Power, authority and responsibilities for decision-making for our children in the system must be restored to families. We are the people who love and care for them. Stand strong and focused, and know that there's many more people with this view in our community, but unfortunately remain silent." Mr Deputy Speaker, I won't name these people, as I know too well why it can sometimes be hard to speak up when the loud voices around you are drowning out your own words, especially when those loud voices ignore the facts. And Mr Deputy Speaker, let there be no doubt the non-government sector knows their fate if Labor were to return to the Treasury benches. Forget about foster care agencies caring for our most vulnerable children. Forget about evidence-based practice to keep families together and out of the statutory care system. Labor is determined to cut the non-government sector out and return to an in-house model with the same poor results they delivered over 16 years. Let's not forget, Mr Deputy Speaker, under Labor, not one FACS community service centre was accredited to deliver out-of-home care, despite requiring that of the non-government sector. Not one. It is only under this government that FACS out-of-home care service delivery has to be held to the same standard as the non-government sector. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I've been encouraged and supported to deliver this reform, to stand strong in the face of being accused of doing awful things that there's no evidence to support. In fact, over the course of the debate, no member in either place has been able to take one clause of this bill and show why it's wrong. The level of debate, even at a technical level, has been trite and paltry. So much for the barristers and lawyers in the upper house. Contrary to the claims of the members of Bankstown and those opposite, consultation was not with a select few. The discussion paper was released for public consultation. In October 2017, the New South Wales Government sought comments, feedback and ideas on the changes outlined within the Shaping a Better Child Protection System discussion paper, and this was done through the New South Wales Government's Have Your Say website. It was widely discussed, widely promoted. FACS received submissions from a diverse range of stakeholders, and engagement with the discussion paper was strong. More than 100 written submissions were received from a range of non-government agencies, peaks, government agencies, public officers, other sector and industry groups, academics, as well as members of the public. FACS held 7 stakeholder workshops across the state in November 2017, targeting key government agencies, regulatory and accountability bodies, legal and civil rights groups, adoption peak bodies and nominated member organisations. Aboriginal peak bodies and key Aboriginal organisations were obviously critical. And I want to acknowledge the Honourable Greg Piper, the member for Lake Macquarie, for his considered and thoughtful approach to the debate. I acknowledge his concerns about ongoing consultation, and I make a commitment here today to continue to work with the sector to consult as we move forward to implement these reforms. I will do this first and foremost through the Ministerial Advisory Group, which is a forum I've convened with non-government peaks and providers, which includes ABSEC. This is where we can bring the sector together to deliver these reforms and allay the concerns that those opposite have shamefully flamed. I will also ensure that the Secretary of FACS requires the Executive District Directors to work collaboratively with communities to ensure that they are working locally across the state with our many stakeholders, local panels and community members. I will work hard to dispel the fear created by those opposite and allay concerns through action. Mr Deputy Speaker, Labor say, as I said, that they will repeal this law if they come to government. So what will they repeal? Will they stop families from having family group conferencing so they can keep their children safe? Will they stop requiring FACS to move with urgency to restore children to their families over 24 months, as they now also require in Victoria and Queensland? Will they condemn their Labor state governments for already doing what we are merely seeking to do? Will they shrug their shoulders at the thousands of children drifting through foster care and emerging at 18 years old, so often lost and troubled, into the frightening world of adulthood alone? Will they wash their hands of the intergenerational dysfunction and abuse and continue to blame someone else? Will they close their eyes to the lost lives and lost opportunities for these children? Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is much work ahead to continually improve the child protection system, and this government will stay focused on reform. We will not play politics with vulnerable people like Labor and the Greens do. This bill will result in continued demonstrated success at keeping children with families where it is safe to do so. And I remind those opposite who say there is no new investment in child protection. The 18-19 budget invests more than $2 billion to protect and support our most vulnerable children, young people and families. I'm advised the 18-19 budget allocates $740 million more for child protection and out-of-home care services than our first budget in 2011-12. That is a 66% increase in our investment in child protection and out-of-home care since we came to government. I remind the House, as part of our response to the Tune Review, the government is investing $90 million over 4 years for 900 families each year to keep them together through evidence-based models, multi-systemic therapy, child abuse and neglect, and functional family therapy, child welfare. These are internationally tried and tested programs which keep families together safely and out of care. And we are providing more money for more caseworkers. This government is leading social policy reform, and understandably those opposite can't stand it. We will continue, despite your lies and your political game playing, to improve the lives of vulnerable children and young people in New South Wales. This bill will do that. This bill will strengthen the ability of children to be supported to stay safely with their families. This bill will mean fewer children will languish in foster care for the best years of their childhood. This Parliament must be determined to break the intergenerational cycle of poverty that has emerged since the war. This Parliament must be determined to break that cycle by doing what is right, not what is easy. Sometimes it's been true that parliamentarians such as all of us here have been overwhelmed by the noisy voices of social media and intimidated by the desperate or the dishonest. But in this case, it's been parliamentarians, those opposite, including the Greens, who have led the distortion, led the lies and the manipulation of vulnerable people for no purpose other than the cheap thrill of a headline or virtuous public chest beating. That is to your undying shame, and history will judge you darkly for it, because you have betrayed the people who need you the most. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would not want to conclude debate on this important bill without reiterating the importance of permanency for a child and of a family in supporting and nurturing them into adulthood and independence. This bill is vital, the reform that ties our other reforms together and ensures they are given life for all our children. The bill that ensures the Department of Family and Community Services has a strong sense of urgency and focus on the needs of children. The bill that ensures families are given every opportunity to play a part in protecting their own children. All powerful changes for good. Any decent opposition would be happy to endorse. And finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to my Liberal and National colleagues, and to the Reverend Fred Nile MLC and Paul Green MLC of the Christian Democratic Party, who have so fiercely supported not only this bill, but my endeavours to reform and improve the child protection system over the past 8 years. Thank you for your support and encouragement, and thank you for your belief that this is the right thing to do. As I'm very fond of saying, the purpose of government is to make people's lives better, and that includes breaking the cycle of intergenerational abuse and poverty that has become such a sorry feature of Australia over the past 60 years. It is not easy to change practice and culture that's grown up over such a time, especially when there are tragic legacies that bring distrust in government and fear of further change. In a good, effective democracy, it is our responsibility as parliamentarians to listen to all sides of a debate, as we have done. But ultimately, it is we who must decide on what is right. You need to know when you vote in this chamber that you have done what is right, right for children and right for the people of New South Wales. You need to know that our reforms have always been driven by data, by facts and by evidence, not by false ethical or moral arguments, but by a clear focus on one outcome, which is making the lives of vulnerable children better than they are today. I can tell you it would have been a lot easier to have caved into the arguments put by the noisy few, pushed off reform into yet another inquiry, and ultimately delay helping vulnerable families. How much more comfortable life would have been if we'd pushed the real facts off to a fight on another day just to keep Labor and the Greens quiet. But then we would not be a Liberal Nationals government. We'd be Labor light. We'd have no courage, no ticker. We could not look these children and families in the eye. And I say this, if dependency on the state is in the DNA of the Labor Party, then aspiration is in ours. Aspiration that every child and every person we serve is entitled to be and to want to be the best they can be, to have the same dreams and opportunities as others, to live their lives independently, free of government interference, but supported by government when they need our help. That is the great goal of our side of politics, to bring opportunity where there was none, hope where there was none. It is by encouraging ambition that we will break down the class barriers so fulsomely lamented by Labor and the Greens, not envy or despair. That is what this bill finally brings to the most disadvantaged children in New South Wales. Ambition, aspiration, hope, a safe and loving home for life. I commend the bill to the House.